Siddharta Guatama was born around 567 BC in a small kingdom just below the Himalayan foothills. His father was a chief of the Shakya clan, and it is said that 12 years before his birth, the Brahmins prophesied that he would become either a universal monarch or a great sage. To prevent him from becoming an ascetic, his father kept him within the confines of the palace. Gautama grew up in princely luxury, shielded from the outside world, entertained by dancing girls, instructed by Brahmins, and trained in archery, swordsmanship, wrestling, swimming, and running. When he came of age, he married Gopa, who gave birth to their son, and he had, as we might say today, everything. And yet, it was not enough. Something drew him into the world beyond the castle walls. There in the streets of Kapila Vastu, he encountered three simple things: a sick man, an old man, and a corpse being carried to the burning grounds, and nothing in his life of ease had prepared him for this experience. When his charioteer told him that all beings are subject to sickness, old age, and death, he could not rest. As he returned to the palace, he passed a wandering ascetic, walking peacefully along the road, wearing the robe and carrying the single bowl of a sadhu. He then resolved to leave the palace in search of the answer to the problem of suffering. After bidding his wife and child a silent farewell without waking them, he rode to the edge of the forest, and there he cut his long hair with his sword, and exchanged his fine clothes for the simple robes of an ascetic. With these actions, he joined a whole class of men who had dropped out of Indian society to find liberation. There were a variety of methods and teachers, and Gautama investigated many. The deep forest and the teeming marketplace were alive with the sounds of thousands of arguments and opinions, and Gautama finally settled down to work with two teachers. From Arada Kalama, who had 300 disciples, he learned how to discipline his mind to enter the sphere of nothingness. But even though Arada Kalama asked him to remain and teach as an equal, he recognized that this was not liberation and left. Next, Siddhartha learned how to enter the concentration of the mind, which is neither consciousness nor unconsciousness, from Udraka Ramaputra. But neither was this liberation, and Siddhartha left his second teacher. For 6 years, Siddhartha, along with 5 companions, practiced austerities and concentration, and he drove himself mercilessly, eating only a single grain of rice a day, pitting mind against body. His ribs struck through his wasted flesh, and he seemed more dead than alive. His 5 companions left him after he made the decision to take more substantial food and to abandon asceticism. Then Siddhartha entered a village in search of food. There a woman named Sujata offered him a dish of milk and a separate vessel of honey. His strength returned. Siddhartha washed himself in the Niranjana river and then set off to the Bodhi tree. He spread a mat of kusha grass underneath, crossed his legs, and sat. He sat, having listened to all the teachers, studied all the sacred texts, and tried all the methods. Now there was nothing to rely on, no one to turn to, nowhere to go. He sat solid and unmoving and determined as a mountain, until finally, after 6 days, his eye opened towards the rising morning star, and he realized that what he had been looking for, he had never been lost, neither to him nor anyone else. Therefore, there was nothing to attain, and no longer any struggle to attain it. Wonder of wonders, he is reported to have said. This very enlightenment is the nature of all beings, and yet they are unhappy for lack of it. So it was that Siddharta Gautama woke up at the age of 35 and became the Buddha, the awakened one, known as Shakyamuni, the sage of the Shakyas. For 7 weeks, he enjoyed the freedom and tranquility of liberation. At first, he had no inclination to speak about his realization, and he felt it would be too difficult for most people to understand. But when, according to legend, Brahma requested that the awakened one teach, since there were those whose eyes were only a little clouded over, the Buddha agreed. Shakyamuni's two former teachers, Ujjaka and Arada Kalama, had both died only a few days earlier, and so he sought the 5 ascetics who had left him. And when they saw him approaching the deer park in Benares, they decided to ignore him, since he had broken his vows. Yet they found something so radiant about his presence that they rose, prepared a seat, bathed his feet, and listened as the Buddha turned the wheel of the Dharma, the teachings, for the first time. The first noble truth of the Buddha stated that all life, all existence is characterized by the Sanskrit word meaning suffering, pain, unsatisfactoriness. Even moments of happiness have a way of turning into pain when we hold on to them, or once they have passed into memory. They twist the present as the mind makes an inevitable, hopeless attempt to recreate the past. The teaching of the Buddha is based on direct insight into the nature of existence, and it's a radical critique of wishful thinking and the myriad topics of escapism, whether through political utopianism, psychological therapeutics, simple hedonism, or the theistic salvation of mysticism. Dukkha is noble, and it is true. It's a foundation, a stepping stone, to be comprehended fully, not to be escaped from or explained. The experience of dukkha, or the working of one's mind, leads to the second noble truth, the origin of suffering, traditionally described as craving, thirsting for pleasure, but also and more fundamentally, a thirst for continued existence, as well as non-existence. Examination of the nature of this thirst leads to the heart of the second noble truth, the idea of the self, or I, with all its desires, hopes, and fears. And it is only when the self is comprehended and seen to be insubstantial that the third noble truth, the cessation of suffering, is realized. The 5 ascetics who listened to the Buddha's first discourse in the deer park became the nucleus of a community of men who followed the way the Buddha had described in his fourth noble truth, the Noble Eightfold Path. These monks lived simply, owning a bowl, a robe, a needle, a water strainer, and a razor, since they shaved their heads as a sign of having left home. They traveled around northeastern India, practicing meditation alone or in small groups, begging for their meals. The Buddha's teaching was not only for the monastic community, and he had said, "Go ye, O monks, for the gain of the many, the welfare of the many, in compassion for the world, for the good, for the gain, for the welfare of gods and men." For the next 49 years, Shakyamuni walked through the villages and towns of India, speaking in the vernacular, using common figures of speech that everyone could understand, and he taught a villager to practice mindfulness while drawing water from a well. And when a distraught mother asked him to heal the dead child she carried in her arms, he did not perform a miracle, but instead instructed her to bring him a mustard seed from a house where no one had ever died. She returned home from her search without the seed, but with the knowledge that death is universal. As the Buddha's fame spread, kings and other wealthy patrons donated parks and gardens for retreats. The Buddha accepted these, but he continued to live on, as he had ever since his 29th year, as a wandering sadhu, begging his own meal, spending his days in meditation. Only now there was one difference. Almost every day after his noon meal, the Buddha taught, and none of these discourses or the questions and answers that followed were recorded during the Buddha's lifetime. That's sad. The Buddha died in the town of Kushinagara at the age of 80. Wow. After having eaten a meal of pork or mushrooms. Some of the monks were despondent, but the Buddha, lying on his side, with his head resting on his right hand, reminded them that everything is impermanent and advised them to take refuge in themselves and the Dharma. He asked for questions the last time. There were none. Then he spoke his final words. Now then, monks, I address you. All compound things are subject to decay. Strive diligently. The first rainy season after the Buddha's parinirvana, it is said that 500 elders gathered at a mountain cave near Rajagriha, where they held the first council. Ananda, who had been the Buddha's attendant, repeated all the sutras he had heard, and Upali recited the 250 monastic rules, the Vinaya, while Mahakashayapa recited the Compendium of Buddhist Psychology and Metaphysics. And these three collections, which were written on palm leaves a few centuries later, and known as the Three Baskets, became the basis for all subsequent versions of the Buddhist canon. This has been your host, Luke. Like this video if you liked it. Subscribe for more. I hope you have a good night. Thanks for watching.